I worked 80 hours a week to support my husband. Then I came home and saw his lover in my house. I used to joke that I had two homes, the office and the house I paid for but rarely slept in. It wasn't really a joke. It was the kind of thing you say to give shape to something that doesn't have a comfortable shape, to make the people around you laugh so they don't ask follow-up questions. I was good at that. I have always been good at giving people something easy to hold on to so they don't press further. My name is Margot. I am 42 years old. For 6 years, I was married to a man named Elliot. For 4 of those 6 years, I was the sole income earner in our household, working as a senior litigation attorney at a firm that rewarded the kind of hours that hollow you out slowly, like water wearing through stone. I billed, on average, between 75 and 85 hours a week. I missed dinners and weekends and the quiet Tuesday evenings that I used to think were unremarkable until they were gone. I missed my own life in the specific way that ambitious people miss their lives, which is that you are too busy building something to notice what is being subtracted. Elliot was a musician, not in a struggling way, not in the garage band playing bars way. He had genuine talent, the kind that made rooms go quiet. He had also, around the time we got married, been offered a contract with a small label that collapsed 14 months later, and what followed was a period of regrouping that extended and extended until it had become simply the way things were. I want to be careful here because I did not marry Elliot with conditions attached. I did not support him financially for 6 years while secretly tallying grievances. I loved him. I believed in his talent. I thought the regrouping was real, that the music was coming, that we were in a temporary chapter that would eventually resolve itself into something more balanced. People build lives on that kind of faith all the time. Sometimes they turn out to be right. I was not right. The night everything changed was a Wednesday in November. I know it was a Wednesday because I had been in back-to-back depositions since 7 in the morning, and I had a brief due Thursday that my associate had been working on but that needed my review, and I had already mentally arranged my evening around coming home, eating whatever was easiest, and sitting at the kitchen table with the brief until midnight. I had done this many times before. It was not a night I had marked in any particular way. I left the office at 8:15, which was early for me, earlier than I had managed in almost 2 weeks. I remember feeling something close to relief in the elevator down, the small, specific relief of leaving a place that consumes you and returning to a place that is supposed to restore you. The drive home was 20 minutes. Our house was in a residential neighborhood of wide streets and old trees, the kind of neighborhood that looks like someone designed it to be peaceful. We had bought it 4 years earlier, when I made partner and the income had changed significantly. Elliot had been excited about the house in a way that I had found, at the time, sweet and genuine. He had opinions about the kitchen and the light in the back rooms, and which walls should stay and which should come down. I parked in the driveway. The lights were on in the living room and the kitchen. There was another car in the driveway, pulled slightly to the left of where Elliot usually parked, which I registered without fully registering. The way you register things when your mind is already partially somewhere else. I went in through the side door, the one off the kitchen, the one I always used. I put my bag on the counter. I was already unbuttoning my coat, and then I heard a laugh from the living room. Not Elliot's laugh, a lighter laugh, a woman's laugh. And then Elliot's voice, low, saying something I couldn't make out. And then a sound that was worse than either of those things because it was the particular quiet of 2 people who are not being careful about being quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a moment with my coat half off. Then I walked into the living room. I am not going to describe what I saw in detail, partly because it is not the most important part of this story, and partly because some things belong only to the moment they happen in, and reproducing them serves nothing. What I will say is that the woman was young. Not dramatically young, not insultingly young, just younger than me, younger than Elliot. Early 30s maybe, with the particular ease of someone who was very comfortable in a space they had no business being comfortable in. And Elliot, my husband, the man I had been financially carrying for 4 years, the man I had reorganized my entire life around supporting, looked at me from across the room with an expression that I have spent a long time trying to find the right word for. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt implies surprise. He didn't look surprised enough for it to be purely guilt. He looked like someone who had been waiting for a thing to happen, and now it had happened, and there was a complicated mixture of dread and something else in his face. Something almost like relief, which was the part I could not make sense of for a very long time. The woman started gathering herself, saying something, her voice high and apologetic. I don't remember what she said. I wasn't listening to her. I was looking at Elliot. I said his name once. He said, "Margot." I said, "Please don't." And he didn't. He went quiet. And the woman left, quietly. And then it was just the two of us in the living room of the house I had bought, in the life I had funded, in the marriage I had apparently been alone in for longer than I knew. I did not cry that night. I want to say that plainly because people expect crying in these moments, and I think there is sometimes an implication, when the crying doesn't come, that the feeling isn't real or isn't large enough. The feeling was very large. I just didn't have access to crying at that particular moment. What I had access to was a very cold, very clear kind of calm. The same calm I use in a courtroom when something unexpected happens and I need to think faster than my emotions can move. I sat down on the sofa. Elliot remained standing, which I noticed. I asked him how long. He said 8 months. I asked if there had been others before her. He was quiet for a moment that told me everything before he said once, about 2 years ago, it didn't mean anything. It ended quickly. I said, "I'm going to need you to go somewhere else tonight." He started to say something about talking, about explaining, about needing me to understand the context. I told him I believed him that there was context, and I told him I did not want to hear it tonight. I told him tonight I needed him to leave the house, and tomorrow or the day after or whenever I was ready, we could have whatever conversation he felt he needed to have. He left within the hour. I sat in the living room alone for a while. Then I went to the kitchen and made tea I didn't drink, and sat at the table and looked at the brief that I still had to review, and at some point, I reviewed it. I worked until 2 in the morning on a brief that was due the next day, because the case did not stop existing, because my marriage was falling apart, and because, if I am being honest, the work was the one place where I knew exactly who I was, and exactly what I was doing, and exactly what was required of me. The next morning I submitted the brief. Then I called a divorce attorney who was not at my firm. What followed was not a swift or clean process. Divorces rarely are, regardless of what the circumstances seem to invite in terms of moral clarity. Elliot did not fight the divorce itself. He knew there was no ground to fight it on. But there were 8 months of negotiation over the house, over the finances, over the question of what he was owed from a marriage in which he had contributed, for the final 4 years of it, essentially nothing financial, and apparently, it turned out, also not very much emotional. His attorney tried several angles. They tried to characterize his creative work, the music, as a contribution to the marriage in ways that should be financially compensated. They tried to establish that the hours I worked had been a choice, one that had damaged the marriage as much as anything he had done, which is a legal argument that is sometimes made, and that I found personally extraordinary given the circumstances, but professionally unsurprising, because I had made stranger arguments myself in other rooms. What they did not know And what became relevant, about 6 weeks into the negotiation process, was that I had kept records. Not because I had anticipated needing them. I am a litigator. Keeping records is something I do the way other people breathe. Over the course of 4 years of being the sole financial support in our household, I had kept detailed records of everything, every expense, every transfer, every financial decision. I had records of the studio time he had booked and the equipment he had purchased. I had records of the allowance structure we had agreed to, informally, that I could demonstrate had been honored on my side entirely. I had 4 years of documentation that told a clear and unambiguous story about who had built the financial life of this marriage and what had been done with it. My attorney looked at the files I brought her and said, with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who recognizes when a case is already decided, that this was going to be straightforward. It was not entirely straightforward, nothing is, but it was significantly more straightforward than Elliot's side had anticipated. There is a version of this story where I am primarily angry, where the focus is on betrayal and the specific injustice of what Elliot did, and the satisfaction of the legal outcome, and the moral accounting of what he lost because of his own choices. That version is true as far as it goes, but it leaves out the part that took me longer to understand, which is what I lost too. Not the marriage, not exactly, because by the end I understood that what I had been maintaining for years was more the architecture of a marriage than the actual thing. What I lost was the version of my life I had been working toward, the idea that the 80 hours a week was temporary, that the balance would come, that the chapter we were in would eventually turn into a different chapter with more room in it. I had been working toward a future that didn't exist. That took a long time to grieve, not the marriage itself, the future I had imagined for it. I left the firm 14 months after the divorce was finalized, not dramatically, not because anything went wrong there, but because I had spent a lot of time in the year following everything sitting with the question of what I actually wanted my life to look like, and the answer I kept arriving at was not the answer I had spent the previous decade building toward. I joined a smaller practice, with a much lighter load. The income is substantially different. The apartment I moved into after selling the house is smaller than I am used to. I cook more, which I had not expected to find meaningful, and do find meaningful. I sleep more. I take Saturday mornings deliberately slowly. I am learning what it is like to inhabit my own life rather than pass through it at high speed on the way to something else. It is a strange education for someone my age, I feel, sometimes. Like a person who has been handed instructions for something after already assembling most of it incorrectly. The work is in the dismantling and the reassembling, and it is slower than I would like, because I have always preferred speed, but I am doing it. People ask me sometimes whether I was naive, whether I should have seen what was happening with Elliot, whether there were signs I missed because I was too busy, or too trusting, or too invested in a particular story about my marriage to read what was actually in front of me. I think that is the wrong question. Or at least not the most useful one. The useful question, the one I have spent more time with, is why I built a life that made me so unavailable to my own experience that things could happen inside it without my knowledge for years. That is not about Elliot's choices, which were his, and for which he is responsible. That is about mine. About the ways I learned, very early, that being indispensable and being productive were safer than being present. That making myself necessary to systems, to workplaces, to people, felt like security. That if I kept moving fast enough, the things I was afraid of couldn't catch me. They caught me on a Wednesday in November. They usually do, eventually. Elliot remarried last year, not the woman from the living room. someone new. I know because we have enough mutual connections that these things circulate. I don't wish him harm. I am not sure I wish him well in any active sense either. He occupies a space in my thinking that has no particular emotion attached to it anymore, which is its own kind of resolution. The kind that doesn't announce itself but you notice it one day. It's quietness. I am not in a relationship. I am not opposed to being in a relationship. I am doing the slower work first, the work of understanding what I actually need from another person, rather than what I have historically been willing to accept. That work takes as long as it takes, and I have stopped trying to put a timeline on it, which is one of the few areas of my life where I have managed to relinquish my preference for schedules. Last Saturday, I sat on my apartment balcony with coffee for almost 2 hours, doing nothing in particular. Just sitting, watching the street below, letting the morning happen at its own pace. For most of my adult life, 2 hours of nothing would have produced an almost physical anxiety in me. The sense that time was leaking, that stillness was lost, that somewhere something was falling behind and I needed to be moving to prevent it. Last Saturday, I just sat. There is something on the other side of the life I was living. I am still figuring out what it is exactly. But I am here for it, present for it, in a way I was not capable of before. Whatever it turns out to be, I will actually be there when it arrives. That, for now, is enough.